The Leave campaign had very cleverly, and with sort of malice aforethought, refused to define what leave actually meant. But do you think that the following things are overall in the world a force for good or a force for ill? We find an incredibly close correlation between what people thought about Brexit and where they fall on that force for ill, force for good on things like globalisation, multiculturalism, immigration, the Green movement, feminism. I'm no longer in the Conservative Party. We might touch on it because there's a sort of data angle to this, but I worked, having worked for David Cameron in Number 10, I worked first on we did all of the research and data for the Scottish referendum campaign in 2014, and then basically bounced straight from that into doing the same for the Brexit referendum in 2016.
Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Sam Knowles. Joining us today is Andrew Cooper, the President and Senior Advisor at Yonder Consulting. A research, data and insights man through and through, Andrew founded the market research company Populus more than 20 years ago, which is where we first met. I was always struck by the smart questions Andrew and his team asked when looking to build research discussion guides. Andrew ran research and polling and then strategy and political operations for the Conservative Party for more than 3 years, either side of the 1997 Labour election victory, and served as Director of Strategy to David Cameron in the Prime Minister's office for almost 3 years in the coalition government. Thanks in no small part to that service, Andrew became Lord Cooper of Windrush and has sat in the House of Lords for almost the last 9 years. Splitting his time between the pollsters Populus, his new venture Yonder and the Lords, I am super grateful that he's found the time to join us here on the podcast. Andrew, and I'm pretty confident I don't need to call you Lord Cooper, it is a privilege to have you join us here today. Welcome to Data Malarkey.
Thank you very much indeed, and you definitely mustn't call me Lord Cooper, you must call me Andrew.
Very good. Now, I trust that's a decent-ish summary of who you are and what you do. Is there anything that you'd like to add, anything that I've got wrong?
No, I don't think so. That sounded like a fairly accurate summary. I mean, I suppose as a sort of footnote, because you mentioned the political hinterland and working in the Conservatives, as you say, I've ended up in that sort of illegally kind of British way. You work for a Prime Minister and you end up in the House of Lords. I'm no longer in the Conservative Party. We might touch on it because there's a sort of data angle to this, but I worked, having worked for David Cameron in Number 10, I worked first on we did all of the research and data for the Scottish referendum campaign in 2014, and then basically bounced straight from that into doing the same for the Brexit referendum in 2016. And having worked right at the heart of that, I fell out quite seriously with the Conservative Party over the issue of Brexit. So for the last 4 years or so, I've sat in the House of Lords as politically non-affiliated.
Right, and that's the technical term, politically non-affiliated, not a crossbencher or a...
A crossbencher is a distinct thing. If you're not affiliated, you can apply to join the crossbenchers. The crossbenchers have their own sort of organisation, their own whipping and things. But there is a group of people who aren't in any grouping, they're not in any of the party groupings or the crossbenchers, and I'm one of those.
How very interesting. Well, yes, I think we will probably almost certainly come back to that, and I have natural sympathy for your for the position that you've taken on that. But before we focus on data and the way that you've worked with data over the past many years, I'd like to go beyond the CV and start with a question that's designed to get to the heart of you. So, could you tell me, Andrew, how do you spend your time?
How do I spend my time? I like to spend my time with my family as much as I can. I like to spend my time reading, mixture, but mostly non-fiction, I think, probably sort of history, podcasts. I like little podcasts. I love listening to podcasts. I love cooking, and I spend a lot of time. I love chopping things. I like very therapeutic, and I love listening to podcasts when I do that. And I find ironing also very therapeutic, and I often binge on sort of whatever the latest box set is while I'm ironing.
I am completely with you with ironing. There are three things that I find not necessarily conducive always to generating insight, but three slightly mindless tasks that allow the mind to range around. One is ironing, one is mowing the lawn, and the other is doing the washing up. I've had a dishwasher for many years. I'm not boasting there, but I find that those three tasks have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so often in our lives, we don't have that, and they also they can be done on kind of procedural memory, so they don't really need much work done. Very good indeed. Now listen, can you explain across your career, but maybe particularly now, what role data plays in your day-to-day work?
I was thinking about that question. You mentioned you wanted to ask that. I mean, quite a hard question to answer because it's sort of, I'm surrounded by it, and it's funny in a way because my sort of inclination and by sort of educational bent, I wasn't a particularly sort of arithmetically minded person. I got a maths O-level, as they were, but not a brilliant one. I scraped a B. I didn't do maths A-level. I did an economics degree at LSE, but actually steered clear of a lot of the more sort of numerical, statistically sided bits of that discipline. I really sort of came into data, I think, because I was always obsessed with politics. And Lyndon Johnson famously said that the first rule of politics is you have to be able to add up. And politics is in many ways it's all about data, really understanding what's going on in politics. I think you have to start to follow the data, and that's what drew me into it. And that's how I ended up. I hadn't really been involved in polling at all until I went to work for the Conservative Party. I went in to be working in the Conservative Research Department with my old friend Danny Finkelstein. We worked together at Social Market Foundation and worked together to CRD, and it happened to be that the vacancy which I filled was the person who'd previously been in charge of the Party's private polling. And knowing almost literally nothing about it, I had to sort of go out there, and the first thing I had to do was to appoint a new polling company for the Conservative Party. This was in 1995-96. So I took kind of intense learning about polling methodology, which I found completely fascinating. This was in the period where, famously in 1992, the previous election, the polls had all been wrong. So it was the end of a period in which there'd been a lot of self-examination and very kind of creditable, open-minded debate about why that had happened and how to improve the methodology of sampling and improve the quality of the data that we're collecting and basing our decisions on. I found that completely fascinating. And ever since then, particularly polling data, obviously, but over the last few years, more and more different kinds of data coming into play. If one's sort of job and hobby is, as mine sort of is, trying to make sense of what people think, why they think it, and how that influences the way that they behave.
I'm so interested to hear. I didn't know this before, but I'm so interested to hear. I myself have a B in O-level maths, and indeed I went on to study classics and fell in love with the storytelling part of things first, because I was badly taught mathematics at a state grammar school in Aylesbury in Buckinghamshire. And when I came back to study psychology in the early 2000s, imagine my surprise to find that all my life was going to be in statistics. So I had to kind of massively overcompensate. So that's good to hear. So polling data is obviously very important, but can you talk about maybe any other types of data that are relevant in your day-to-day work now, maybe particularly with your Yonder company?
Yeah, I mean, we and again, sort of coming out of the limitations of traditional polling. So again, the polls, we for a long time we were doing political polling, a lot of voting. We did the polling for the Times newspaper for a decade, and that was the days when the world wasn't flooded with daily voting intention polls once a month. It was quite an event. So there was a lot of on winning that contract. A lot of the pitch process actually was about talking about the methodology of how do you accurately measure voting intention, and those polls, ours and most other people's, were roughly right for a period, and then they went wrong again in 2015 when all of the polls said that there would be a hung parliament again, and of course the Conservatives won. So at that stage, we started to look at other kinds of data to see, we know how we can put together what looks like a roughly representative sample of the whole country into a poll sample, but it turns out that's prone to producing an inaccurate picture of how many people are going to vote, which people are going to vote, and how they're going to vote. So we started to look at census data, firstly to see could we learn anything which would help us make our poll samples more representative of the whole country, but also just to see were there some patterns within the demographics of voting that would tell us something. And we, by trial and error, we created this model which we call the clock face. And that's based on census data. So basically what we did was to take the 5% of the census that's published at an individual level, anonymized, census microdata. And by trial and error, we basically tried different ways of bucketing it up, basically in sort of Harry Potter terms, like a sort of sorting hat. We took every single census factor and we allocated it to one of two dimensions, and then sort of ran the numbers ran the elections across it to see whether it sort of mapped. And we ended up with this model where the two dimensions we sum up as security and diversity. And essentially, the security axis, the vertical axis, is census data that relates to people's economic security and well-being. So it's things like their occupation, their income, their wealth, their housing tenure, their health, all kind of collapsed into a single axis. And the horizontal axis is census data that relates to how urban or rural, how densely populated, how ethnically diverse is the census output area where you live. And what we found is that when you map the country in that way, and you create sort of a scatter map where you've got 300,000 census output areas scattered at the intersection of the axis, the centroid, and then we coloured in those little dots according to which party had won those constituencies, and suddenly it was an incredibly straightforward way of really clean lines. Where what we saw was that 2015, when we did this, the Conservative Party won almost every constituency that was both high on our security factors and low on our diversity factors. And the Labour Party won almost every constituency that was both high in diversity factors and low in security factors. And where the two sort of scatter maps met in the middle, actually that was where the marginal seats were. So it was very graphically straightforward, but incredibly robust way of starting to understand something important about politics. And then we continue to experiment with it. And because it's a geodemographic model, any large data set that comes with postcode, we can map directly onto it. So, for example, we took, some years ago, there was a BBC programme called The Great Personality Test, which they did in association with Cambridge University. And off the back of that programme, about 650,000 people went to the BBC website and took Cambridge University's psychological profiling questionnaire. And because they published the data, we were able to scrape that and apply the postcodes to it. So we were then able to map psychological archetypes on top of voting behaviour. And suddenly you're starting to build up this kind of this textured, layered understanding and see the interrelationship of things. And then we go to 2016 and the EU referendum. And we did the same exercise, and we had a bit more modelling because the EU referendum was counted at local authority level, not parliamentary constituencies. So we had to model from authorities into constituencies for comparability. But what we then found was that the Brexit referendum, when you map it in that way onto the census demographics, the kind of fault line is on a different plane. So rather than being dominated by an axis where you've got the Conservatives high in security, low in diversity, Labour high in diversity, low in security, the Leave vote is heavily concentrated in the bits of Britain that are defined by being low in security and low in diversity, and Remain dominates in the bits of Britain that are both high in diversity and high in security. And what that means is that the kind of battle line, the kind of marginal seats, as it were, of that referendum, that line cuts right through the heartland of both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. So half of the Conservative heartland, the bit which is more diverse as well as well off, voted to Remain, and half of Labour's heartland, the bits of Labour heartland which is quite non-diverse as well as being less well off, voted to Leave. And so this analysis, this demographic analysis, this way of modelling census data and overlaying polling data, we felt literally in sort of one very clear chart told an incredibly powerful story of how Brexit basically broke the structure of British politics. And because of building on that census foundation, we're able to kind of layer up. We can start to see the interaction of all kinds of different things. So we for example, we now use this model for a lot with the BBC because we can map onto it people's feelings about the BBC, their propensity to pay a license fee, and then you can map onto what programs they watch. And you start to get this really kind of three-dimensional feel. So, for example, we always point out that if you put the bang in the middle of this model, something which, in a country where some issues divide us on an economic plane or a cultural plane within these sort of 2 dimensions in the 4 quadrants, bang in the middle, so not divided at all. And in those things, we have Love Island. The television program which sums up Britain is Love Island, in the sense that whichever of those polarities you're in, you're equally likely to like it. Whereas there are some other programs like Handmaid's Tale or for example, Peep Show, Black Mirror, which will very, very much skew into kind of Remain country, or Mrs. Brown's Boys, which is way down in the heart of kind of Brexit country, or things like Top Gear, which is in the heart of the kind of the conservative bit of the map, the bits of the country which are economically secure and non-diverse. So we now use this a lot with clients, and we show this. I mean, it's a great kind of talking point. It's a great introduction to clients. It's a great away day fodder. So I often find myself doing it at kind of company away days, and business leaders look at that, and the first thing they always think is, "God, I'd love to know where my organisation sits in that map." It's a very good way of kind of pulling back and seeing the kind of the overall context in which an organisation is existing and all the different sort of macro factors that are at play. And it also captures how complex it is for a business to engage with its consumers. You know, if you're a large consumer-facing business, you actually have to have a relationship with people in all of these different bits of the map. And what the model captures is the complexity of that. And actually, you know, when you start to put values on it and things like that, you know, we use it to look at purpose for business. Most people think that the businesses should have a purpose beyond just making money and selling stuff and employing people. But when you ask people, what do you think the priorities are for a business's purpose, it scatters all over the place. So a business which has to have a relationship with everybody, all different kinds of consumers, may have picked a purpose that only really resonates with a small part of the picture. So yeah, it captures the sophistication, the complexity, and it shows how much harder it is to communicate effectively with all the different kinds of people in the country than is often assumed.
It sounds incredibly powerful, and I can absolutely imagine either the marketeers or the comms people or the leaders of the business saying, "Where are we? Where are we? I think we must be here." I can absolutely imagine, both into. I mean, maybe utilities aren't quite the same, given that they were. Well, then of course they're not state monopolies at all now, but utility companies, media companies. Clearly, you've mentioned BBC, but kind of mass market retailers. We're can imagine where Little and Oldie may sit relative to Tesco and Sainsbury. It's what I think sounds so impressive. And I was going to ask you a question about, what challenges do you face in making sure that data is useful to you, kind of clean and intact and usable. And I'm sure there are some, but I mean, the line that leapt out for me there is that across 2 dimensions, clearly dimensions with lots of variables loading onto them. I completely get that. It's not a simple thing. It's not a simple thing, but across those 2 dimensions, the line that you used, kind of how Brexit broke the structure of British politics, I think is it makes me think. I don't know if you know the work of Simon Baron-Cohen, not Sacha, but his cousin Simon, the Autism Research Centre up at Cambridge. And he has, in a completely different field with completely different factors loading on, but he has a systemizing and an empathizing kind of two by two dimension. It sounds like in terms of politics, but also in terms of consumer behavior, that there's at least some kind of analogy between mapping individuals. And when you describe the you could see where the both Remain and Leave and Tory heartland, Labour heartland, and then the marginal seats kind of at the fringes of that. That reminds me, I saw Sam Baron-Cohen give a talk end of last year, where he was showing how individuals mapped and whether or not they would have an autistic diagnosis or not, or Asperger's, based on this, and it was clear one another, and then there was a sort of the marginal seats in the middle.
Fascinating.
Yeah, really, really interesting. Presumably the things change, right? Things don't stay the same. You talked about, the polling model being broken when you were in '92, again in 2015. How do you keep your clock-face model to be fresh? Are you constantly kind of loading new data sets, new variables? I mean, really interesting to hear how you map that census data on top of polling data, and then the BBC Great Personality Test as well. Are you constantly looking for new sources of data to map onto the clock-face?
Yes, we are, and obviously because it's based on census data, obviously ONS publishes some data between censuses, but we're just in the process of kind of rebooting it with the latest census data. The micro data, it takes a while to be published after the census is done, but that's just happened. But also, for example, another great source is parliamentary petitions. I can remember you set it up. We have this system where there are public petitions, and if once 100,000 people sign a petition, it has to be debated in Parliament. And again, you can scrape that data and get the postcodes. So, and some of them are really funny, sort of very, very narrow niche topics. So, if you're a business and you want to know about the people who are really, really kind of forensically interested in some particular dimension of your, if you're a water company, for example, and you want, people who are really, really, really worried about sewage releases into waterways, if there's a petition on that, we can scrape that and we can map it onto the model. And the moment you map it onto the clock-face model, all of the other sort of data and insight and all the other layers that are already built into it is already there. So sort of at a glance, you can suddenly see the interrelationship of being very concerned about a particular topic and what your media habits are, what TV programs you watch, which parties you're likely to support, what your psychology is, how you feel about the responsibilities and priorities of businesses. So I think it's a very powerful tool we're constantly looking for. And we've also now we've got there's two ways of mapping onto it. I mean, if it's a big data set, we can do it with postcode. We also have an algorithm which basically uses an attitudinal proxy. So there's a set of about a dozen questions we can ask people on the basis of their responses. We can approximate where they would sit on the model. So we can basically any kind of survey data that includes those questions, and we do that a lot with businesses. We work with one of our major retailers, and they gave us 500,000 random cut of their loyalty card holders' postcodes, and we're able to map them across the model using the typologies of those loyalty card holders that that company used, and it told them a really compelling story about the kind of demographic arc of their customers and where the kind of holes were in terms of who wasn't shopping with them as much as they thought should be.
I don't envy the task that your data engineers need to do to harmonize and homogenize and to make sure they don't sort of clearly they don't completely flatten out the intelligence you can get out of data. I've got enormous respect for them. I'd love to see, given that I live in Lewes, East Sussex, and my wife regularly swims at Seaford, where I think there have been 321 something like that, emissions of sewage over and near the Seaford mermaids. I'd be fascinated to see there'd be a sort of bulge, I think, in the universe. And there's been some very active. Lewis has got a tradition of Tom Paine was born here and wrote The Rights of Man here, and we have our bonfire tradition and all the rest of it. But it's a slightly weird place. But I'm sure there'd be a bulge around that sewage issue. Sounds absolutely. Fascinating, but kind of real, kind of commercial dynamite in your hands as well, because you're enabling your clients, your prospects, from whatever sector, media, retail, whatever, to understand this very, very complicated world. It seemed as though the world had got too complex to understand, but you seem to be reining it in. Would you say you're reining it in?
I mean, it's a very good explainer. The other great thing about it, because it's built on census data, it's incredibly robust, and everybody can see that. But also because it's based on census data, any country that publishes its census data in a reasonably granular way we can create an equivalent model. So we've created clock-face models for the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, France, Germany, Italy, Spain. So it's a powerful tool for countries that operate in more than one market. It creates a kind of it captures the dynamics within each market, but in a way which is directly comparable with the other markets. And it's interesting that when we look at some of the macro trends that we observed in the UK from it, particularly the kind of political rotation that's happening, is basically happening everywhere. And essentially, the story which comes out is, I think, at its simplest, is that globalization, first the economic disruption and then the kind of cultural and social disruption that came from globalization has caused a reaction in which, in every market, people who are defined demographically by being both relatively less well qualified in terms of education, relatively less well off, and living in less well connected, more rural, less diverse places, in every country, those people have been becoming more nationalistic in their outlook, and seeking more populist solutions in their preferences. And that's had the effect of shifting the centre of gravity of the main centre-right party in each country, and displacing other people. And what's really interesting, after we observed this, and I went back and I found an extraordinary speech that Tony Blair gave in 2006. So I think to some extent Brexit sort of brought some of these things to the surface, but what the model captures that is actually that shift had already started to happen in the 1990s, and Brexit in a sense was a consequence of it, not a cause of it. And Tony Blair did a speech 10 years before the Brexit referendum, before it became much more visible, in which he said that the emerging fault line of politics was ceasing to be the economics of left and right and starting to be, in his terminology, open versus closed. And interestingly, when we mapped on that Cambridge University psychological profiling, in the sort of neutral language of psychology, closed lands bang in the middle of where Brexit was, the bits of Britain defined on our model by being both low in security and low in diversity, and open lands right in the heartland of where Remain is. So it does actually start to align with that, and I think so. It's people whose reactions to globalization were either respectively to have the impulse really to kind of to shut out those big storms and changes, or alternatively to embrace them, really is the defining thing. And what we then find was when you map onto that some other macro attitudes. So, for example, on a very simple polling question of do you think that the following things are overall in the world a force for good or a force for ill, we find an incredibly close correlation between what people thought about Brexit and where they fall on that force for ill, force for good on things like globalization, multiculturalism, immigration, the green movement, feminism, a whole range of things, which actually cluster really tightly. And that tells us something else really important about the Brexit issue, which is that for most people on both sides, it wasn't really or just a question about what the UK's relationship should be with the European Union. That question was, whether people realised it or not, was actually a proxy for a much deeper set of kind of core values and a kind of world view. And I think that explains why it was so polarising and divisive, and why so few people changed their minds. So I thought we learned a lot from layering on the data in that way.
Fascinating, listen. There are echoes, but only faint echoes, and you are an ethical organisation. But it makes me think of some of the things that the not remotely missed Cambridge Analytica claimed they were able to do and understand. Actually, it seems as though you really genuinely are. The other thing that sprung to mind was, I remember there was a 2021 census, wasn't it? That's the data that's being released currently by ONS. And I remember the 2011, because my town is near Brighton, the 2011 census revealed that 29% of Brightonians declared themselves to be Jedis. I was I was deeply there was a campaign to disrupt the census, at least on that religious question. And I know actually there's been some census data released recently. We're talking in May about Britain being one of the least religious countries in the West. Maybe that's partly down to the Jedi movement marching down here in East Sussex. I kid. But I wanted to ask you a little bit more about kind of your time in politics, and your non-aligned status, which I should have been aware of but wasn't aware of. But can you tell me a little bit about the role that data and evidence played, particularly at your time of Director and Strategy in the Prime Minister's office? And then maybe if you're willing to unpack a bit about what led to your disenchantment and your decision to be non-aligned?
Yeah, of course. Well, I went in, we did all the private polling for the Conservative Party after David Cameron became leader in 2005 to 2010. And in the beginning of 2011, he asked me if I would go and work there. So I took a leave of absence. And I went in sort of principally as the party's pollster to be sort of closer to them and make sure that we were sense checking how people in the country were feeling. This was in the context of the coalition government, then an unusual event, but also austerity in very tough times coming off the financial crash. Trying to, it was part of the sort of aspiration at the beginning of the coalition to try to make a virtue of the fact that two parties had been brought together in adversity to try to take on some of the difficult issues facing the country. And they were very keen to have to make sure that poll data was being used to really try to understand some of those issues. So, ironically, in a way, for example, social care, the coalition commissioned Andrew Deal, not the former director of the IFS, to do a commission to try to resolve that problem. And he came up with a plan, and we used research a lot to try to really understand people's fears and anxieties about getting the balance right on that issue. I did a lot of work on immigration. It's very topical still as an issue, but one of the things we did, David Cameron, I think all politicians have this sort of anxiety that they'll become out of touch. And it's very difficult in reality for politicians properly to remain in touch with the lives of ordinary people. But one of the things we did was a very, very simple device where every week we would ask the unprompted poll question: if you could talk to the Prime Minister about only one thing, what would it be? And we would map it as a word cloud, and we would do a little bit of analysis. But the thing that's striking about it in that period was that every single week, bar about three, the number one issue that people wanted to talk to the Prime Minister about was immigration. And it made him very kind of conscious of the fact that this was, and obviously not everybody approaching that from the same angle. But we therefore then did it. We used data a lot to try to understand what do people mean by that, and then try to get to a sensible policy solution. And actually, I failed to persuade them of this, but actually, what we found was when you really unpacked it, when you asked people about all the different types of immigration, actually, what you found is that most people weren't worried about most of them. So, for example, by far the biggest element was then, and I think still is, students coming here to study from other countries. And most people's view was that that was actually a good thing for the country. People want to come here. And people bought into the idea that actually universities are a kind of asset, and they're one of the things we should be most proud of. And if people want to come here, that's great. People didn't think they should necessarily be able to stay indefinitely after they finished, but that was conditional as well. It depends what skills they have and what kind of jobs they're going into. So I use this to try to argue that actually you could have a much more nuanced discussion about immigration with the whole country if you, instead of producing one number each time, as they just have just in why don't we unpack it? This is the total number. We're not going to hide the total number from you. This is the total, but actually within that, this is how it breaks down. And we, the government, take the view that actually the problem bit, quote unquote, is only this bit. Do you, the country, agree with that? Because if so, we can focus in on that. And the politicians were very, very reluctant to do that. I think partly because actually, if you're the Home Office and your job is someone's made it your problem and you have to bring it down, some of the easiest bits to control are some of the bits which people are actually least worried about. It's much easier to squeeze down students coming here than it is some of the other things. So I failed to succeed in that argument. But the health service as well, we have the Andrew Lansley health reforms, and we were collecting a lot of data, including trying to collect some data within the medical professions to really try to understand better how some of these political reforms were being perceived, how to refine them, make policy better, and in particular, and above all, how to communicate them in a way which made sense to people, which ensured that we were talking to the concerns people had about those policies.
And just tell us a little bit about what it was that made you kind of fall out of love and become non-affiliated around the Brexit referendum and afterwards?
Well, I think obviously, within the Brexit referendum, that in a sense was dominated by data, and there was even quite a fraught argument about perhaps the most famous bit of data was the £350 million a week, which was slapped on the red bus that Boris Johnson went around the country in, which was, of course, not actually true. And it was very frustrating in the Remain campaign because it wasn't true, but actually, in a sense, it was a trap that Dominic Cummings had laid, because what he wanted us to do was to say, hang on, it's not 350 million a week, it's only 178 million a week. Because, of course, 178 million also sounds like a vast amount of money, and it's impossible really to explain to people in the context of what governments raise and spend. 350 million really wasn't a significant sum, and 178 million certainly wasn't. And also, it was the frustration that that was a hard bit of data, and we really struggled to come up with an equivalently straightforward bit of data to capture our argument that the net effect of being in the EU was hugely to the country's benefit. And there wasn't an equivalent simple number that captured the benefit of the EU in the same way that they were capturing and presenting the supposed cost of the EU. And that led us into two sort of strategic errors, I think. Firstly, the Treasury tried to create a number, and George Osborne's Treasury team came up with a number that of £5,500 would be the cost to an average household of leaving the EU, which was both unbelievably high to most people in a country where the average incomes were in the low 20,000s a year. And people thought that's unrecognisably high number. I can't believe that much of my current income is coming from the EU. Lots of people in focus groups would say, well, I've never had a cheque for £5,500 from the EU. It was also implausibly specific as a round number, but actually part of our argument was they're telling it it's going to be brilliant if we leave. Well, actually, the truth is leaving is a huge risk, and nobody really knows how it's going to play out when we leave. It's just that they're telling us we can have our cake and eat it and everything will go our way, and that doesn't seem very likely. Well, on the one hand, we're saying it's very risky because you couldn't know, and on the other hand, we're saying, but we can know specifically to a round number what the cost will be. And the other strategic error, which came out of the lack of data to make our case, was a reliance on experts, famously decried by Michael Gove, and by a sort of parade of business leaders and others, leaders of organisations, leaders of acronyms, assuring the public that actually it was in their interest to stay in. And in a way, we were sort of psychologically almost making the other side's argument for them, because the people who are drawn to leave, people for whom the solution to the challenges in their lives felt like shutting out the world, shutting out globalisation and leaving the EU, they already knew that people like that, experts and bosses of big businesses, were in favour of the EU, and all we were really underlining was that the EU worked in the interests of people like that, we weren't making the argument just to how the EU could work in the interests of these other people who felt that it wasn't. So we lose. And I think then what happened from my point of view in the Conservative Party is that the two main political parties responded in different ways to the fact that the demographics of Brexit cut on a different plate to the demographics of their traditional support. The Labour Party tried to avoid being defined by it, tried in a sense to fudge the issue so that it could hold on to both the very Remainy bit of its base, the more highly educated, younger liberal metropolitan people in urban areas, and hold on to the more Levy bit of its base, which subsequently came to be called the Red Wall. And they sort of got away with that in 2017, but in 2019 they got squeezed because basically they were neither sort of pro-Brexit enough for the Red Wall bit, nor anti-Brexit enough for the other bit. The Conservatives, almost overnight, and with great alacrity and ease, opted to be defined by Brexit, and it basically almost overnight became a Brexit party, which was very rational in one sense. If you look at the distribution of Conservative constituencies and how they voted, if you look at where Conservative members and activists sat, that was the balance was so strongly in that direction. It was the rational thing to do. Now, I mean, having said that, on Brexit Day, 42% of people who'd voted Conservative the year before voted to remain in the EU. It was a large minority, but it was a minority. So you could sort of see the logic. But actually, I thought if you look sort of further back in terms of the history, you go back kind of 60 years, ever since coming out of the Second World War, ever since the idea was first had of some kind of community of European countries working closely together, it was central to the Conservative Party's belief system that was a good thing and that the United Kingdom should be part of it, including through the period of the 1950s when we weren't part of it, and the period where we were vetoed, including through the periods when it was a Conservative government that applied under Millen and was vetoed, including through the period when the Labour Party was opposed to it, first under Gateskill, and then again in the 1980s. It was a central belief. When the first referendum was held, that was voted through by a huge majority of Conservative MPs opposed by Labour. The vast majority of Conservative voters voted to stay in. Most Labour voters voted not to stay in 1975. The histories of that referendum say that the whole kind of spine and structure of the Keep Britain in Europe campaign in 75 was the Tory party machine. Even in Margaret Thatcher's Bruges speech, she talked about the importance of the UK staying in the EU. So I just thought it was extraordinary that just all that history got just flipped on its head almost literally overnight. And then, because of course, no one had, the Leave campaign had very cleverly and with sort of malice aforethought refused to define what Leave actually meant. They wanted it to be basically a referendum on how much don't you like the European Union rather than what will Leave mean. After having the vote to leave, of course, the debate moves on to the question of what does that actually mean then? And Theresa May's incredibly unhelpful Brexit means Brexit. And that argument became more and more hard-line. And in a sense, to my mind, what the vote for Brexit meant, what was wrapped up in it, was redefined in an ever more hardcore way. So suddenly, though during the campaign, lots of the pro-Leave campaigners had explicitly said, well, obviously we'll stay in the single market. After the referendum, they started to say, well, staying in the single market would be treachery, it would be betrayal of the Leave vote. And the line kind of moved, it became more and more hard line. And I couldn't, as fundamentally on the Blair open closed divide, I'm fundamentally an open person. And I felt the Conservative Party was becoming more and more nationalistic in its outlook, and actually, to some extent, an English nationalist party, not even a British nationalist party, and defining Brexit in this ever more sort of purist way. And I just didn't agree with that. So in the House of Lords, I found myself voting against the government over and over and over again. And in the end, it was silly to pretend that I had if that was such a defining issue and I didn't agree, there was no point in remaining in the Conservative Party. So in common with lots of millions of other people, I ended up, I think, finding myself kind of politically homeless because of that sort of structural shift that the data revealed that has happened after the Brexit referendum.
Well, good for you, and I'm glad that the cognitive dissonance was strong enough to make you non-aligned and non-affiliated. What a fascinating story, and but also how interesting that you've been able to through this application of data in your clock-face model, being able to understand kind of why that's happened and what that means. I guess I've got a kind of in closing, I have a Columbo question for you. In the way that you work with data, is there anything that I haven't asked you that I should have asked you?
No, I don't think so. I mean, we could burrow into the minutiae of the complexities of voting intention and what goes wrong with voting polls and things. But no, I think we've covered all the main bases.
Very good. What I might ask perhaps is maybe in the wake of the next general election and whether or not models have been good or not, maybe we could come back for a part 2. But listen, Andrew, thank you so much indeed for sharing those really powerful and persuasive insights. Tell us, whereabouts can our listeners, our viewers, find out about what you and what you're up to online in social media? Is there anywhere that you hang out in particular?
No, I mean, I was on Twitter a lot, and actually I found Twitter to be, I decided it wasn't a very healthy environment, really. In a world where I worry about how polarised we're all becoming and about how narrow the channels in which we exist, which just sort of increase that polarisation, I decided that being on Twitter wasn't a good thing. So I sort of observe Twitter, but I don't really participate.
In the show notes, I'll include links, obviously, to Yonder and to where people can find out more about the Clogface, because I think people will be genuinely interested. Listen, Andrew, thank you so much for your time, for sharing your approach to using data smarter in the political and the business world. I think it's fair to say if there were more people with your pragmatic but data-driven approach, there would be rather less malarkey in this world of data interrogation and rather more data-driven common sense. Andrew Cooper, Lord Cooper of Windrush, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thanks, Sam. It's been great fun.
Thanks so much for listening to Data Malarkey, the podcast about using data smarter. To find out what kind of data storyteller you are, why not take our data storytelling scorecard? It takes just 2 minutes to complete and will give you a personalized report right away. Visit data-storytelling.scoreapp.com or follow the link in the show notes.